One of the questions I get asked a lot is, why does handmade pottery take so long? And honestly, I completely understand the question, because when you look at a finished mug or a bowl or a vase, it's easy to think, okay, someone sat down at a wheel, made this, glazed it, fired it, but how long could that possibly take? The reality is there are so many steps between a lump of clay and the finished piece that you actually get to use in your kitchen. And today I want to show you what that process really looks like. It starts with clay, and even before I sit down at the wheel, I have to prepare the clay. I weigh it, I wedge it, I make sure there aren't any air pockets, and I get it into the right consistency for throwing. Sometimes I throw clay straight from the bag. Most of the time, it's reclaimed clay from projects that I've made before. For something like one of my larger pieces, I'd be working with quite a bit of clay, and then I'd either use it for hand building or throwing on the wheel. In this specific instance here on the video you're seeing, this was for a hand building project. This is a little glimpse of the process that it would take to reclaim your clay, but I'm not going to go down the rabbit trail on this one. This is probably the part people picture when they think about pottery. You sit down, you throw the piece, and you're done. Except that you're definitely not done. Sometimes I'll spend several minutes throwing a piece, and sometimes I'll spend a bit longer depending on what I'm making. And even when something comes off the wheel looking pretty good, it might not actually stay that way. Clay has a mind of its own. It moves, it shrinks, it cracks, it warps, handles can break, edges can dry unevenly. Things that looked perfect yesterday can look completely different the next morning. So there's actually a lot of letting the clay tell me what it wants to do. And this is where pottery gets really funny, because a huge part of making ceramics is actually waiting. The pieces have to dry, and they have to dry slowly and evenly. If they dry too quickly, they can crack. If one part dries faster than the other, they can warp. So sometimes my job is literally to just leave it alone, which is not always easy when you're looking at a shelf full of pieces that you desperately want to finish. Once the clay has firmed up enough, I can come back and trim the pieces. Whether I'm hand building or trimming on the wheel, the piece has to be in a leather hard state before I can touch it. This is where I can clean up the bottom, refine the shape, and give the piece some of its final proportions. And this is also one of those steps that you don't really notice when you're holding a finished piece. You don't look at the bottom of a mug and think, oh wow, I think somebody spent some real good time trimming this. But it's part of what makes the piece feel finished. Then there's all the little details: handles, spouts, feet, carving, textures, whatever that particular piece needs, and every single one of those things has to be made and attached by hand. So when I'm making a batch of mugs, for example, I'm not just making the mugs, I'm making every handle, then attaching every handle, then cleaning up every attachment, and then checking every piece again. Once my pieces are bone dry, I go through them again, and this is where I start looking for little imperfections. Sometimes I find something I can fix, sometimes I can't, and that's just part of working with clay. Not everything makes it. Some pieces crack, some pieces warp, some don't come out of the kiln the way that I expected, and sometimes an entire batch can come out completely different than I imagined. Which brings me to my favorite part, and also the most stressful part: the kiln. This is where all the work I've done so far gets put to the test. The pieces are loaded into the kiln, and then they're fired to extremely high temperatures. And once I close that kiln, I have to wait. I can't open it and check on things. I can't change anything. I just have to trust the process. And that's one of the strange things about ceramics. You can spend hours making something, days drying it, hours glazing it, and then you put it into a kiln and you don't actually know exactly what you're going to get back. After the first firing, I can finally glaze the pieces, and glazing is a whole nother process in and of itself. I have to mix the glaze, get the consistency right, apply it evenly, clean up the bottoms, and make sure nothing is where it shouldn't be, and then load everything into the kiln again. So yes, we're firing it again. And this is why I always chuckle when someone sees a finished piece and says, "Oh, that's so cute, how long did it take you to make?" Because the answer isn't really 3 hours or 20 minutes. It's more like, I started making this piece weeks ago. And even that doesn't really capture it, because I'm trying to make multiple pieces at once. Some are drying, some are being trimmed, some are waiting to be glazed, and some are in the kiln. And some didn't even survive the kiln. And some are sitting on a shelf waiting for me to figure out what they needed next. It's basically a constant cycle. And then finally, after all that, there's the part you actually see, the finished piece. The espresso cup sitting on your balcony, the lidded mug you bring to the coffee shop, the handmade dishes you eat off of. And that's the part I love the most, because most of my pieces aren't made to sit on a shelf and never be touched. I make functional ceramics because I want them to actually become a part of someone's everyday life. I want someone to reach for the same mug every morning. I want a bowl to get scratched and used and washed and used again. I want the pieces to become part of a home. And I think that's what makes all of the time worth it. And I think that's also why handmade ceramics are different from making something that was mass-produced. When you buy something handmade, you're not just buying the clay, you're buying all of the time that went into it, the decisions, the mistakes, the pieces that didn't work, the hours at the wheel, the waiting, the firing, the finishing, and not to mention the fact that somebody actually stood there and made that individual object with their hands. There will be little differences between every piece, and honestly, that's the point. So the next time you look at handmade ceramic and think, why does that cost so much? Or why does that take so long to make? Just remember, you're not really looking at a piece of clay. You're looking at weeks of work that have been condensed into one little object that you can hold in your hands. And that's the beauty of ceramics. You start with the dirt, you add water, you spend an unreasonable amount of time worrying about it, you put it in a giant fire, and somehow at the end of all that, you get something that can become part of someone's home. And I don't think I'll ever get tired of that. So yes, handmade ceramics does take a long time, but that's exactly what makes them worth making. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this from me, hit that subscribe button. Thank you.